Imagine a world lit by carnival bulbs and cigarette smoke, where the extraordinary walked a thin line between exploitation and celebrity. In this largely forgotten slice of American history, giants, sword swallowers, and conjoined twins became urban legends beneath striped tents and hand painted banners. Let's pull back the curtain on the reality, or is it the unreality, of sideshow lives here on Things Visible and Invisible. Marc Hartzman is an author, journalist, and award-winning advertising creative director known for his writing about unusual history, the paranormal, and other bizarre subjects. ABC News once described him as one of America's leading connoisseurs of the bizarre. He has authored several books, including American Sideshow, an encyclopedia of history's most wondrous and curiously strange performers, and his latest book, To the Hilt, A Sword Swallower's History of Sword Swallowing. And he joins me down the line from his home in New York. Marc, welcome to Things Visible and Invisible.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. Appreciate it.
Marc, I suppose the first question that comes to mind is what got you interested into the bizarre world of sideshows?
This has been something I've always been fascinated by. When I was a kid, I used to get the Guinness Book of World Records every year when it came out. This was back when they were little black and white books, like the shape of a brick. And I was fascinated by that first section, which was, I think it was called The Human Body. And there was a man named Robert Wadlow, who's the world's tallest man ever. He was 8 feet, 11 and a half inches tall. And I was just amazed by this guy. And I'd see these pictures of him, and he was dwarfing everyone around him. When he was, like 8 years old, he was a foot taller than his dad, something like that. I mean, it was just amazing. And I love seeing the different images they'd have of him every year. And then there were the other people in the book as well. The guy with the long, crazy long curly fingernails, the world's heaviest twins, the littlest person. So I just really got into this amazing world of how the body can take on such different shapes and sizes. I just was really fascinated by that. And then I loved Ripley's Believe It or Not when I was a kid as well. And I saw The Elephant Man when I was probably too young, about 7 years old, and that really stuck with me. So fast forward a few decades, or into college at least, I would say, I started a zine. I was just self-publishing. And as that went on, I just started writing more about sideshows because, again, I loved it since childhood. And then I met a sword swallower named Johnny Fox, who ran a small museum in New York City called the Reconsidering. And he just had this remarkable collection of sideshow memorabilia, things he'd collected over his years of performing. And I got to know him and wrote an article about him. Ended up writing about him also for Bizarre magazine, which was based out of London, and then continued freelancing stories for Bizarre, which was a lot of fun. And so over time, I built up these connections throughout the sideshow community, just talking to one person. They introduced me to another person. And I was so fascinated by the topic, and they recognized that in me, that I was passionate about it. I wasn't a professor from a college trying to get a sociological point of view about it, or trying to say what's wrong with sideshow performing or anything like that. I was, I have a genuine interest in it, and I think they felt that with me. And so I was able to meet all these different people, and they become friends, and those connections help make possible me writing American Sideshow. And then since then, I've written many articles. I used to write for AOL Weird News. I was the sideshow beat guy, basically, which was a lot of fun. And I wrote about 80 articles on sideshow-related stories for AOL. And then, as you mentioned, more recently, I just did To the Hilt with my co-author, Dan Meyer, who's a sword swallower friend of mine, who I've known for about 20 years now. And he's done a ton of research on the topic, and we put it together into this beautiful book. So, yeah, I've just, like I said, it's always been in me. I just find it fascinating what these people can do, the challenges that they've overcome. And I just really find it quite interesting.
Now, you're not that old, Marc, so you wouldn't have remembered the heyday, I guess, of sideshows. I think a lot of people watching this will have no idea what you're talking about, first of all. They won't understand what a sideshow is, or a circus even, maybe. So I think we better go back to the beginnings. Let's go back to when circuses or carnivals began to have sideshows that were, shall we say, unusual, bizarre, things that could be true, maybe were not true, but people just enjoyed the thrill. When did that first start to appear in history?
I mean, this really goes back to around the mid 1800s, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but you have different performers or different showmen starting to take performers out on the road uh, as a way to, entertain people in different towns that they would go to. They'd have unusual people who people would pay good money to go see. Sideshow performers made a lot of money in the 1800s and early 1900s. Sideshow kind of became more of a term, I suppose, with P.T. Barnum when he had his circus and he took sideshow performers out of his American Museum and took them on the road and put them alongside the circus. It was a show on the side of the circus, basically, so a sideshow. And you had all these different kinds of people, people born different. The armless man, the legless man or legless woman, people with no limbs at all, bearded ladies, giants, little people, conjoined twins, all kinds of just incredible people, even people with a parasitic twin, which would be like an unborn twin that was jutting out of your body, usually at torso and limbs and functioning. So these were just remarkable things for people to see, and you couldn't see these things anywhere else. This was before television, obviously before the internet. So people saw things they'd never seen before. And for these people, this was a time in history when there wasn't really any other option for them to make a living. So if you were, an armless man, you didn't really have many job opportunities in front of you, or a legless man, for example, and people weren't going to hire you. Sometimes families were embarrassed by relatives with these kinds of conditions, and they might hide them away at home or institutionalize them because they didn't know what to do with them. So the sideshow gave them a place to have camaraderie. They were all with each other. They had friendships. They found love. They made a lot of money. They traveled the world. They were the stars of the stage. They were truly the kings of the show. And so they were able to make a living, and they were able to, they were going to be stared at anyway outside. And here they were able to get paid for that. So for them, it was a good way to make a living, like I said, and find that camaraderie with others who were also born different. And then you had another kind of class of sideshow, which is called the working acts, which are people who teach themselves particular skills, like sword swallowing, which is 100% real. Sticking a 2-foot steel blade down your throat. Don't try it at home, but people learn this skill. Fire breathing, the human blockhead, where you take a nail and you hammer it into your nose. It goes back into the skull. There's a cavity back here, and there's a hole in your nostril that it can go right through and into. I've done it just to try it with direction, of course, from professionals. So don't try that one at home either. The bed of nails. So all different kinds of things called working acts that anyone could do. Even at that time, too, in the 1800s and early 1900s, you had tattooed people who were fully covered in tattoos that were an attraction. Nowadays that's it's not just an attraction anymore. There's a lot of people who have that, but back then, of course, that was very unusual. And they would, of course, have stories around that. They were usually embellished for entertainment's sake.
So, I mean, you've painted a very interesting world that emerged in the 1850s onwards in the United States. I'm assuming we're talking about principally the United States. But I suppose, first of all, was there any kind of, shall we say, I mean, today, for example, when I was doing some research on this subject, there was an immediate, on the internet anyway, there was an immediate sort of reaction against it, that this was exploitative, that this wasn't something we should be interested in. That was the feeling I got when I was researching it. Obviously, sensibilities were different in the 19th century, but was there any sense where people sort of, church groups or other groups that sort of said that this was exploitative, that these people were being made sort of spectacles and that this wasn't right?
Those kinds of attitudes started to come about around the mid-1900s. People feeling that it was very politically incorrect to put people on stage and exhibit them for the anomalies that they were born with. And there were certainly cases where you could say that, yeah, people were exploited in one way or another. Usually that would be a case with, for example, like a microcephalic, who's a person with a tiny head. And so their mental capacity is low. And so people might be taking advantage of them because maybe they don't even know what they're getting into. And there's a story about a man named, who was called Schlitzy. If anyone watching has seen the movie Freaks from 1932, directed by Todd Browning, It's a wonderful film, and Schlitzy is in that film. So he's a microcephalic, and there's a lot of other performers from that era. Uh, and Schlitzy was one that people might say was exploited because again he wasn't he had limited mental capability just because of his condition. But Schlitzy was eventually institutionalized and was doing terribly there. And he was rescued by a showman who happened to work at that institution during the off season, and he pulled him back out and got him back on stage. And Schlitzy loved the stage, and you could see that he found joy in life again. He loved the crowd, he loved interacting, and the smile came back. Whereas in the institution, he was miserable. Um, so there's an argument to be made that maybe they were being exploited in one way or another, but maybe they were also in some cases at least finding happiness being out with other people and not being trapped into institution, which sounds miserable also, or rather than the sideshow. But there were also cases where people, they were called the do-gooders who said, oh, this is wrong. We need to get them. We shouldn't have people staring at these people. And this is not what should be happening in society. And what that started doing was taking away these people's living. And sideshow performers fought back against that. They said, why are you telling us we can't do this? This is our choice. This is how we're making a living. And you're going out there saying we can't do that. And now you're taking away our ability to make a living. And so it became kind of controversial for people who were trying to do what they thought was good and get them off of the stage. Performers didn't necessarily want that. So there's definitely another side to the story. In other cases, you might say, well, there were certain conditions that doctors didn't know how to treat back then, and now they do. So maybe some performers who didn't have a choice back then could get healed in some way. For example, a conjoined twin, Chang and Eng, the original Siamese twins, because they were born in Siam, hence the term Siamese twins, who were connected by a ligament at the chest. They couldn't sever that in their era, in the 1800s. But today they could do that. So there's certain performers who may not have had a choice, 100 years ago, who may have choices today to be separated and live a normal life. And by normal, I just mean not conjoined. So, it's a different time and different attitudes for sure. But again, I think that if people want the choice to go out and make a living this way, that's their choice, and others shouldn't take that away from them.
Sure. Just to frame our story, Mark, it starts in roughly the 1850s. Would you say by the Second World War or just after the Second World War that this kind of sideshow had sort of more or less run its course?
It started to die down a bit by that point. So in addition to what we just discussed, you also had other things competing for people's attention. So at this point, you had movie theaters. You had television emerging at that point. Before that, basically your entertainment was the circus and sideshow coming to town. That was the thing to go do. Now you had other things pulling you away from that. You had, like I said, you had films you could go see. You could stay home. You could watch television. Even at carnivals and circuses, not circuses, but at carnivals that might come through town. Now you had rides that might also draw you away, and that's where your money might go instead of the sideshow. So there were other things at play that were kind of competing for people's attention and dollar at that time. Now, sideshow never fully went away. It's still here. You can still go see sideshows. Coney Island has had one going since. Well, Coney Island always had a history of sideshows, but another one emerged in the 80s and is still continuing this day at the Sideshows by the Seashore. There's other touring shows as well, so it's never gone away. There was a showman named Ward Hall and his partner Chris Christ who started the World of Wonders sideshow in the 60s. Ward had been a showman since he was like 15 years old, going back to the late 40s. And that show is still continued on today. So again, there are certainly sideshows still continuing on, just not quite as many or as robust as it used to be.
So sticking with what we could term the golden era of sideshows and carnivals, how did the circus, how did the promoters, how did they find these sideshow individuals?
Well, certainly they could have scouts looking for interesting people, hearing stories about people and approaching them and offering them a contract to tour with them. In some cases, a human anomaly, someone who was born different one way or another, might actually approach someone like P.T. Barnum and say, "Hey, I'd like to work in your show." One example is a man named Charles Tripp, who was an armless wonder, who performed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So no arms, he did everything with his feet. So he would be on stage, and he would do things like, he would shave, he would eat with a fork, he would write with his toes, he would carve wood with instruments with his feet. So he would do all these different things to show that he could do everything anyone else could do, but with his feet, since he had no arms. And he went into P.T. Barnum's office to introduce himself and show what he could do, and was hired right away. So you had different ways. It was people either seeking out the showman, or the showman hearing about people, whether it was on their own or through scouts or whoever it might be, as they go town to town, and then approaching them and seeing if they'd be interested in joining the show.
Right. Now, the carnival life, the circus life, as we know, is one where it has its own little world that people inhabit, which is comforting in a way, and you've alluded to that. But it's also sort of isolating as well, and whatever problems are there are going to recur in that small spectrum. Was it a case that some of these people, after a while, after the initial contract, after maybe the initial excitement of being on the road, sort of were in some sort of a loop where they couldn't really escape from? As you said earlier, Mark, they couldn't really do anything else, and that the carnival became not so much a home as a sort of a refuge, the only place that they could exist.
I think that, from the stories that I've researched, it felt like a lot of performers spent many years with those particular shows, and whether they were jumping from one show to another, they weren't necessarily with the same show all the time. But I do think that that was a life that they had gotten very used to, and that they were, like I said, they were making money, they were supporting their families. In some cases, I'll give you an example. There's a woman who performed in the 1930s named Betty Lou Williams, who had a parasitic twin. I'll show an image here of her, so you can see the twin kind of jutting out from her torso there. And she started at a pretty young age, as you can see from that photo. So she was born in 1932, and she had 11 siblings that she was supporting from her earnings in the sideshow. She was making about $1,000 a week in her heyday in the 1930s. Late 30s at that point. So that was really good money. And she was able to buy, land and homes for her family. So that's what she did. And, someone again like that wasn't going to have a lot of options outside of the sideshow, especially at that time. So, yeah, I think that for most people who were involved, it was a decision, and that was kind of what they did. And they had that sort of familial feeling and community within the sideshow, that if they left it, yeah, it was a little bit different. There were cases of people who, like working acts, who could get out of it. Obviously, that's a little bit easier, because when you are a sword swallower, for example, you can leave the sideshow and you look like anyone else at that point. No one has to know you were in the circus or you were a sword swallower. So there were cases of people like that who left the circus life, the sideshow life, and went on to other kinds of careers and did other things. But, if you have a parasitic twin sticking out of you, you can't, you can only hide that to a certain degree. And there's not a ton of options. Again, at that time, things were very different. Today, it might be a different story. You have different options, and people are very inclusive and welcoming. But, it's a different era.
Absolutely. In some ways, just listening to you, Mark, I'm conscious that our 21st century sensibilities are being transferred backwards, when in fact what you're saying is that many of these individuals were just performers. They were just, that was their job, that was their career. They accepted their lot, and they accepted they could make a living in the world of carnivals, circuses, sideshows, or whatever. Presumably they were just part of this circus troupe. Were they seen as any different from, I don't know, the trapeze artist or the clowns or whatever else was on offer?
Well, within the sideshow itself, they were the stars. They were the true stars. So they would have made more money than the working acts, people who looked normal but did unusual things.
Right.
So they were the ones who really made the big money. And this was a bit different than maybe the trapeze artists who were more in the circus side of things. But I haven't seen anything where there were any, disputes or anything where they weren't getting along. Actually, I have a quote I want to read quickly from American Sideshow, which I love. It's from 1959, so it kind of hits on this era that we're talking about, when things started the politically correct feelings started to kind of come out and people started questioning these things. And this is how I opened the Silver Age, which is that sort of, mid 1900s era. But this is from a showman whose name was Dick Best. And he said, "Who's going to support these people if they can't support themselves? For the past 30 years, I've been able to give enjoyment to scores of them, give them financial independence and companionship. You realize this when you see a mule-faced girl, a guy with 3 legs, and a girl weighing 500 pounds playing poker with a guy who shuffles and deals with his toes. In a crowd like that, nobody sits around feeling sorry for himself or anybody else. You could be accepted there if you had 9 arms and 10 heads." So to me, that quote says so much about what people were able to experience there, that they weren't going to experience anywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've talked about the film Freaks, which was made in the early 30s. That painted that sort of picture, that somehow this was a little world within a world. It's interesting that film was banned in many countries, so that the initial reaction was one that this was a subject or subject matter that wasn't suitable for a wider audience. In wider American society, how did they view the sideshows? Were they a sort of a dark secret? Were they a sort of a guilty secret even for some?
I mean, early on, I think people flocked to them. People were fascinated.
Right.
It's, curiosity is just innate within us, right? Like you can't help but be curious. You're going to turn your head if you see a man with 3 legs across the street, or a man who's 7'7" or something like that, right? Like you can't help but look. So curiosity is just within us. Whether or not they felt bad when they went to go see them is another story. And there may have been a little bit of both. It's hard to say that for sure, but people definitely went to see them. They liked seeing something different. It was interesting. It was unusual, and you didn't really get that when you were really confined to the small town you were in. A lot of people at that time, they didn't really travel a lot, right? It wasn't easily accessible to go traveling around and seeing all different kinds of people and different cultures. Again, this was before television and the internet brought everything right to you. So this was just a totally different experience that they were having. So yeah, I think that probably it varies by different people how they actually felt when they saw them. I really like to look at these people as people who triumphed over something that was really unusual for them, right? To be born with no arms and to completely get over that, I think is, find a way to make a living and find friends and love and all these things. I think it's remarkable what they were able to do given what they were, the hand that they were dealt with life.
Do you think there was an element of that for those that went and they maybe went with a sort of sensationalist idea of seeing somebody with 3 legs or whatever it happened to be, some anomaly of some sort? Is there any reference, sir, in your research where you came across where people went with that kind of sensationalist view and then came away feeling sort of thankful for what they had, or viewed these people really as you've just described, as great survivors, really?
I don't know that I came across like specific quotes from people who viewed them and said that they felt a certain way after it. Usually you see more about reports of who was performing and what their unique skill was or what their performance was like, but there weren't a lot of like particular crowd reactions that at least that I was coming across from that particular era. I do feel though that if you see people succeeding in that way, I'll give you another example. There's another man who's in the movie Freaks who has no arms or legs. He was called Prince Randian, and in the film he rolls a cigarette with his tongue and lips and rolls it and smokes it, lights the match and everything just with his mouth. And he was married and had 4 kids and supported them. And I feel like if a man with no arms and legs can support his family, like you should feel like, okay, well, what's your excuse? You should be able to go out there and find a way to succeed or at least make ends meet if this guy can do it. So I do feel like I think they should be looked at as inspirational. If they can do it, so can you.
Now, another Hollywood film based on the book Nightmare Alley comes to mind. I'm sure you've seen it. I'm thinking of the Tyrone Power, not the most recent one. But that painted a very dark picture of Carnival life, one of many deceptions, but also it brought to the fore this idea of the geek show. Was in your research, first of all, did the geek show actually exist?
Yeah, there were geek shows. I didn't really write too much about geeks in American Sideshow, uh, but yeah, that would be one where you could say that was a little bit darker for sure.
Yeah.
That there were some disturbing things going on with the geek shows, but again, it was people were paying money to be shocked, and that would be one where yeah, might be a little bit disturbing, not inspirational, as the other people I was just referencing. So yeah, there was definitely that side, and that's something you don't really see anymore. But there were people who would you know do a geek show with snakes, which was very bizarre. So yeah, that's maybe a darker side. And like you said, there was deception. The Nightmare Alley is more with the he's a mentalist, and so he's got his assistant. And they kind of work out ways to deceive the public as if they're reading their mind or that they know certain things, which taps into kind of the whole spiritualist movement at that time as well, with mediums who would know certain things from the dead. So those kinds of things, yeah, that was deception. But they were doing this as entertainment on stage.
So, would it be fair to say, Mark, that the Geek Show was something separate from or different from what you're writing about and what we're talking about, the Sideshow, that it was something which the Sideshow wouldn't really recognize?
You might have a geek show within a sideshow, or a geek show might be considered like a single O in some cases, potentially, which would be like a single show at a carnival, kind of on its own. But yeah, it's connected. It's just they weren't always in sideshows by any means.
Because I'm wondering if that's where some of the, again, the later sensibilities comes, where they lump all of this in together as purely exploitative. But from your researches, it appears that people who had physical anomalies or were born in a certain way, that they sort of they used this. They yes, it was spectacle, but they also became part of a circus act, and as you say, they found a home. Talk to us, maybe give us one or two examples in your researches. Who were the people that really stood out for you, or still sort of fill your mind with good thoughts? People who you think, yeah, they really did triumph.
I'll give you a quick example that kind of goes back to something I said earlier. This is a book I put out a few years ago, which is a scrapbook of the rubber skin lady, Agnes Schwarzenbacher. And this is her right here on the cover of these three images. And so her great niece contacted me a few years after American Sideshow came out, and she said, I have this scrapbook of my great aunt from her sideshow travels in the 1930s, and it's a remarkable scrapbook. So I reproduced it with the help of her and her husband, and this is every page of her scrapbook of her sideshow life. So you can see just she had tons of photos. Some of them were their promotional cards. Some of them were her personal photos. There's family photos in here as well. And then I wrote a bit about her own life. And so she was someone who, as you saw from those pictures, she had this loose skin that was very stretchy beneath her waist. She could stretch it out maybe about a foot or so. And her family was ashamed of her, and they wanted her to always wear a long dress, cover it up, stay at home. And she didn't want that. So she left. She was not really wanted by her family. So she left and she joined the sideshow, and she got married, and she was someone who traveled all over the place, and got to experience the world, which she wouldn't have done otherwise. So, I look at her as someone who triumphed over a very strange condition that she was born with. So I think she's a pretty good example. And again, like someone who her family made clear that they were kind of ashamed of her condition, and she didn't need to feel that way. Why did she need to, be doom and gloom her whole life because of how she was born, when she can go out and make a living and have people, feel like she's a star, and again, find friendships and find a husband.
Absolutely. Absolutely. She had as good a life as anybody else from the sounds of things. So that's one. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many amazing stars. That one of my favorites is Johnny Eck, who also was in the movie Freaks. He's actually the guy on the cover of American Sideshow. trying to get rid of the glare. There we go. So without any legs, this is his twin brother, who you can see has legs. And Johnny Eck did everything. He did much more than most people with two legs do. He was an artist. He had trains he would run, like model trains, but like the kind that you could ride on. He did like race cars. He did magic. He was in the obviously the sideshow performer. So he did all kinds of things beyond just performing on sideshows. He didn't let anything stop him. Um, so I find him to just be remarkable. And when you watch him move in the movie Freaks, because you can actually see him in action versus just still photos, he moves with such agility, like it's nothing. And again, it's just like, wow, this guy didn't let anything stop him. He just overcame it and did what he wanted to do. And I'll tell you a quick story. One of my favorite stories about Johnny Eck, in terms of performance, he did a stunt with his brother, who you saw with the full legs on the cover, his twin. They worked with a magician. So again, this was like 1930s era. The magician would call a volunteer from the audience, and that would be the full-size brother, Robert. And Robert would walk up on stage, and he would get into a box, lay down in the box. The magician would then saw the box in half, the old saw the person half trick, pull the two halves of the box apart to show that he had cut through the box, put them back together, and then open the box, and the man would step out of the box and start to return to his seat back in the audience. But before he left the stage, the top half would jump off, and that was Johnny Eck, and he would run off stage with his hands. And then the bottom half would run off stage the other direction, which they had swapped in Johnny Eck, obviously, and a little person with pants pulled up over his head for Johnny to kind of just rest upon his shoulders. And so it looked like this man split in half and went both directions. And people freaked out at that. They fainted, they screamed. And so they actually had to stop doing that stunt because that proved to be a little bit too disturbing for audiences. Because again, like, what a rare, unique thing to be able to pull off, right? For a guy with no legs to happen to have a twin with full legs to pull off a stunt like that. I would have loved to have seen that personally. That's one of my favorite stories from the world of sideshow.
Now, you mentioned P.T. Barnum and the other great promoters of circuses and carnivals, who were obviously entrepreneurs. They made a lot of money with these kind of ventures. I'm wondering, did they take a paternalistic attitude to these sideshow lives that they were dealing with, or were they just another performer? Was it just another person on the payroll?
For P.T. Barnum, I'm not 100% sure if he took on a kind of a paternal role with his performers. I suspect Barnum was a bit more business oriented, that he knew that certain people were going to be profitable for the show and that they would make money together. Certainly, he made a ton of money with Tom Thumb. They both did very well touring around. Tom Thumb was one of his earliest performers. His real name was Charles Stratton. But there were performers, there were showmen in the early 20th century who I think were very much paternal figures and did very much care for the people that they were exhibiting in their shows, which did feel much more like a family. And those were smaller shows. P.T. Barnum had the big circus sideshow, of course, in the late 1800s. But yeah, I do think that early 1900s, there were those examples of showmen who were a bit more paternal, but still business minded, because that was their business. So you had a little bit of the two kind of working together.
In your researches, Mark, did you come across any real tragedies of these sideshow lives?
Yeah, I mean, there were a few. There's a strange story about two albino brothers. They were albino black men with dreadlocks. They were called Iko and Iko. Those were their stage names. They were called the Ambassadors from Mars, again, just because they looked a little bit different, capitalizing on the interest in Mars that was, very much so in the early 1900s, in terms of, potentially life on Mars. And so they had this weird role, and they were, as the story goes, they were apparently like taken from their home when they were children and put in the sideshows. And it wasn't until many years later that their parents discovered them in the show and pulled them back out. And so that was a very awkward situation, obviously, because like were they kidnapped basically? It's not 100% clear on what exactly happened. But then they were at home and they kind of had nothing to do.
Yeah.
And they missed it. And they ultimately went back. And one of the brothers, I think it was George. His name was George Muse. I'm forgetting offhand his brother's name. It's been a long time since I wrote about them. But George Muse actually lived to 108. So I think he had a long life and had many adventures along the way, for better or worse. But I discovered that when I was researching them. So that this book came out in 2005, and I think George Muse died around 2002 or 2003. It was right around when I was researching, and I thought, oh my God, this guy was still alive recently. It would have been amazing if I could have spoken to him. At first, I never even imagined that someone who was performing in the 30s would still be, alive at that point. So that was pretty remarkable to see. But yeah, I think they're one of those cases where you'd say that they were exploited. They were initially put into Sideshow, not willingly, but from what I recall in their own comments, that ultimately they did find some joy and entertainment in doing that, despite the circumstances around it.
The way you're framing this, Mark, it's a showbiz tale. It's not really to do with the idea of a freak show or anything like that. It's just a showbiz tale that some people have a special gifts, and these people, their gift was often something they didn't want, but they took it and they made the most of it. They navigated the world of showbiz with the entrepreneur or with the impresarios and the shows and the traveling and all of that. They made as much money as they could, just like any performer. Is that the sort of takeaway that you found in your research on this, that this is really just another American showbiz story?
I mean, yeah, I think so. I mean, like I said, they were the stars of the stage. To them, this was show business. They became celebrities, and they made really good money in that era. If you equate, like I said, $1,000 a week for Betty Lou Williams in the 30s, that's phenomenal money. So yeah, I think for them it was a chance to be in show business, and there weren't many other opportunities for that kind of thing. You know what I mean? And what else were they really going to do at that time? Sitting at home was not a life, right? Sitting in an institution is not a life. So for them, it was a good option at the time. I mean, in most circumstances. Again, I don't want to make that a blanket statement for everybody, but I think by and large, from my research, it worked out well for a lot of people. And of course it worked out well for the showmen too. They made good money off these people, but the people performing did well as well. So I think it was a good show business deal. I mean, there were certain cases. I'll give you another example of maybe the tragic one. I mentioned I saw The Elephant Man when I was a kid, and the story of Joseph Merrick, who was put into a sideshow in London in the 1800s. That was a sad story. I mean, he was one of the most disfigured people in history. It was horrific, the condition that he had. And he was working in workhouses when he was young, and eventually to a point where he really couldn't do much of anything. And then the movie certainly portrays the showman as not treating him very well. How awful he was really treated is, hard to be sure of. But then when Dr. Treves found him and took him into the London hospital, he cared for him. And I always found that movie to be another example of someone really, it's a very sad movie, but I always felt like it was very triumphant at the same time, because Merrick found ways to appreciate the things he did have, and find beauty in life around him. So again, he overcame a lot, but I think he went through more than possibly, anyone else ever.
Yeah.
It was really a horrific condition he had.
Absolutely. Now, your latest work, Mark, is around sword swallowing. When I first saw the title and started looking at it, I began to wonder if sword swallowing was really an illusion, like a good magician on stage. It's all a trick. But I think you might have another view.
It's 100% real. And I think every sword swallower gets asked that question. In fact, my co-author, Dan, talks about that in his introduction to the book. I'll show the book quickly here. This is my co-author, Dan Meyer. swallowing the sword here, and he's been doing this for over 25 years now. He travels the world swallowing swords. He's a full-time sword swallower. But everyone we wrote about, it's all real, and they have to, because there's that initial doubt. It's one of those things it's when you see it, you think, how can that be possible, right? Like, how can the body actually take in a 2-foot steel blade down the throat without slicing you up and cutting you and killing you? And it, I think I mentioned this earlier. Like, don't try this at home. People have died from swallowing swords. It is very dangerous. So it's very real. It's also 100% dangerous. Accidents do happen. A lot of times accidents happen, and sword swallowers will recover and they'll go back to it. But recovery could be months till they can swallow a sword again. And like I said, some people have actually died. So it can also be fatal. But yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of training. Usually people learn through a mentor that helps guide them and teaches them the right way to position yourself, align yourself properly, suppress certain gag reflexes. There's a lot that goes into it. I don't want to make it sound like it's too simple or oversimplify anything. It's not something I want to try. I'm perfectly happy to just write about it, as I mentioned in my intro to the book. But I find it, again, fascinating that people learn what the body is capable of and can do these amazing stunts. And people have gotten very creative with it over the years, whether it's swallowing multiple swords or swallowing different objects. Dan swallows a giant pair of shears, a car axle. People have swallowed, very long screwdrivers where there's no handle for anything to retract into. People always think the sword retracts into some sort of magical handle. So people will swallow things that have no handle to show that, like, there's no place for the blade to go. It's going into my body. People will swallow neon tubes, which is also very dangerous because there have been cases where the glass will break and the neon is, it's poisonous. So that can be very deadly. But they'll swallow a neon tube. It goes down into the stomach, it hits the bottom of the stomach, and then they'll turn off the light on stage, and you'll see their neck glowing where that neon is in their throat. So again, it's a way to prove, like, look, this is real. You can see it glowing in my throat right now. In fact, I have another modern day sword swallower, Heather Holiday, who talked about when she would perform, she'd have her belly showing through her stage outfit, and people were saying that they could see her belly button also glowing. So there's her neck and her belly button glowing, which was pretty interesting. So again, people will do these unique stunts to help prove to their audience that this is 100% genuine. There have also been lots of x-rays. Performers sometimes will show the x-rays. Dan has a video of the sword actually going down his throat through x-ray, so you can actually see it happening as he's doing it. And it's been used by doctors to kind of help, I think it was to help endoscopy kind of develop. Actually, they use sword swallowers to figure out how to put things down, a tube down people's throat safely. So sword swallowers have been used to help medical teams figure particular things out, different kinds of techniques and so forth. So yeah, it's a fascinating history. Lots of really amazing performers.
Now, I have to say, Mark, it is fascinating, but you're not selling it to me. I don't think I'm going to be applying as a trainee sword swallower any day soon. But final question just on this. Well, it's a sort of two-pronged question. When did this phenomena first occur? Was it again the 1850s? Was it a circus? Or is it something much older? And also in your researches, why does somebody become a sword swallower?
Well, that's my favorite question of how this whole thing began. So a lot of people will say it goes back to India, like several thousand years ago, with different like Indian fakirs or shamans also, who would do certain things to prove that they had these amazing capabilities, or that a shaman might say, like, oh, look what I can do, I've got the power of God or whatever it might be, and follow what I say, these kinds of things. So they might be used to kind of establish some dominance or something like that. I do have a case mentioned in To the Hilt, where there's an ancient Roman text from, I think, the 1st century AD, or maybe it's the 2nd century AD, but anyway, a long time ago. And it talks about a sword swallower actually swallowing a sword for entertainment value. Usually you figure it took a while for swords to, usually a sword was always used for combat, right? You didn't have a lot of time to play with a sword for entertainment. If you were using a sword, it was to defend yourself in some way. But eventually that kind of traveled up through into Europe. And as a performance, it really started in the early 1800s. There was a time before that when sword swallowing may have been looked at as some sort of witchcraft and was not looked upon kindly. But by the early 1800s, it became more of a showmanship type of thing. But I always do wonder, like, who that first guy was that swallowed a sword, and was he successful, or did he hurt himself badly trying it? And someone else looked at it and said, well, maybe I can do it. And then they tried it. Like, how did this whole thing begin? Because it does seem pretty nuts to think that you can just stick this, metal rod down your, steel blade or whatever it was, down your throat. So we don't know for sure when that exactly first began or who that first person was to succeed, but it's kind of fun to think about. But in terms of performers in the 1800s and moving on to today, because we still have people learning today, of course, I think it's one of those things that in terms of a working act and the sideshow, it's sort of the culmination of skills. So people will learn different skill sets: fire eating, human blockhead, bed of nails, even things like juggling, magic, things that are kind of related in that world. But then sword swallowing is the one thing that's really very difficult to learn. So if you can master that, you've sort of reached the top of the working acts. And so I think that once you get into it, you just kind of want to keep pushing yourself to see what else you're capable of. And usually people, like I said, will find a mentor. Some people have done it without a mentor, which I, would not recommend at all if you want to learn, because you could certainly get hurt doing that. But yeah, I think it's one of those things you kind of get in your system, and you want to try to replicate what you've seen other people do in history, and create your own version of it. And how can you push the art further? So yeah, like I said, it's not for me either. I have no desire to do that. But I think most people who get into the role of sideshow, a lot of them find their way wanting to take it to the next level, and that's always sword swallowing.
Marc, tell people where they can find out more about you and where they can also pick up a copy of one of your many books.
Yeah, I have a website, markhartzmanbooks.com. So you can find all my books there. It's Mark, spelled with a C. And they can all be ordered from there as well. But you can go on Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, or any of their online bookshops. You can find all my books there. On Instagram, I'm just at Marc Hartzman. I'm pretty easy to find. You can follow me there. I post stuff about my books, but other weird things as well. And I also run a website called weirdhistorian.com, where I write about all kinds of other weird stuff. So sideshows and weird medical history and spiritualism, paranormal, all kinds of fun, weird stuff, UFOs, all these things. I love it all.
Marc, for now, thank you so much for coming on Things Visible and Invisible.
Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of Things Visible and Invisible. We're dedicated to uncovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality, from ancient enigmas and paranormal encounters to scientific anomalies and forgotten histories. If you enjoyed this journey into the mysterious and unexplained, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell to stay updated on future explorations. Have a personal experience or story that aligns with our investigations? We'd love to hear from you. Visit our website at tvi.show and reach out through our contact form. While we can't feature every submission, we review them all, and your story might be featured in an upcoming episode. To support our continued investigations, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter or channel member. Your contributions make these explorations possible and give you access to exclusive content, early releases, and monthly behind-the-scenes discussions with our team. Don't forget to check out our merch store. We've got everything from TVI-branded t-shirts and hoodies to stickers and coffee mugs, perfect for showing your support while keeping the mysteries close. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time as we continue to explore the things visible and invisible.